Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Before we get started, I want to invite you to come to Unwind, a free drop-in practice session that I'm leading each week on Zoom. It lasts about 30 minutes and just long enough, hopefully, to fit between all your other tasks and to-dos. Each week, I give a brief science-backed tip to help with stress management or well-being enhancement. Then we spend about 15 minutes in a guided relaxation, meditation, or contemplation practice. Lastly, we end with a few minutes for discussion and personal connection. I encourage people to make the session work for themselves, so if you prefer to call in or keep your camera off, that is just fine. You can get more details and sign up to get the Zoom link and call-in information at drkateking.com/unwind. Hope to see you there.
Hello, I'm Alex Gukja.
And I'm Dr. Kate King. In this episode, we talk to David Treleaven about teaching and practicing trauma-informed mindfulness and the intersections between this work and larger issues of social justice.
David Treleaven, PhD, is a writer, educator, and trauma professional working at the intersection of mindfulness and trauma. He's the author of the acclaimed book, Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, which was a #1 new release on Amazon. David's work has been adopted into multiple mindfulness teacher training programs around the world, including UCLA's Mindful Awareness Research Center, the Engaged Mindfulness Institute, and Bangor University's Masters in Mindfulness program in the UK. Currently, he's a visiting scholar at Brown University.
You can learn more about David and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you find the conversation interesting and engaging. Well, we are delighted to be here with David Treleaven. Welcome to Noble Mind.
Thank you. Thanks for having me both.
And why don't we just start off, as we usually do, with having you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you're excited and interested in.
Sure. Well, we're having this conversation. I am in the Bay Area in California, which is quite a time to be here. And I'm originally from Toronto, from Canada, where my family is currently. So I've been down here in the U.S. for about 12, 13 years now. Most of my family texts me daily and they say, what's happening down there? And are you coming home? So the short version of my story is that I grew up meditating. I started as a teenager in Toronto with a great teacher who was doing a young adult, or almost like a teen group. Ended up practicing quite seriously for a long time. Had a difficult and challenging experience in my own personal practice around what I call dissociation, where I was really disconnecting from my body. And after about 6 months of trying to work with that, a couple of friends and colleagues said, hey, have you done much work around trauma? Which I hadn't. I was trained as a psychotherapist, but really hadn't taken a deep dive into trauma. And it opened up this really big inquiry for me about the particular relationship between mindful attention, meditation practice, and traumatic stress, and how they all go together. I ended up doing a dissertation on the topic. It got video recorded, which was kind of awkward, but I'm glad it happened. And the video ended up reaching a lot of people, surprisingly. And so for a couple years, people were emailing me and saying, hey, can I talk to you? I had this experience. I feel like it was connected to trauma. And so I ended up becoming kind of a collector of stories and was learning a lot about people's experiences around trauma and mindfulness. And after a while, I had some strong views about it and was encouraged to write a book, and I did. And it's called Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness. And really the punchline or the main focus is, what would meditation teachers or anyone offering body-based practices need to know about trauma to offer it in a safe way, in a way that's really leveraging the power of mindfulness and avoiding some of the potential pitfalls, which we might talk about.
I was delighted that your book describes the ubiquity of trauma, which some people may be surprised to hear. Now, can you say more about that and how you understand trauma and PTSD?
Yeah. Well, when I wrote the book, it's interesting now that I'm doing interviews where the book now came out a couple of years ago, and already so much has changed in the last couple of years around trauma. Bessel van der Kolk, that some folks will know, wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which really was one of the texts that I just think has brought trauma so intensely into the mainstream and having conversations about trauma. So when I wrote the book, I use the word ubiquity to say that there's just a commonality to trauma. We so many of us will experience it. Research tells us that about 90 to 95% of us will live through at least one traumatic event, which won't surprise many listeners. But then inside of that, there's this whole complicated spectrum. About a small percentage, research tells us about 3 to 7% of people will experience post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And then we have this whole range or spectrum of people that might experience symptoms of trauma known as post-traumatic stress, or some people that experience a trauma and are just fine. They might even be stronger for it. So when I talked about the ubiquity of trauma, it was just to acknowledge that in any room where mindfulness is being practiced, in all likelihood, someone in the room will be struggling with trauma on some level. But I use the word ubiquity because I felt like I needed to put a little weight behind the writing and say, hey, this is important. But I think even 2 years later, I don't think this would be a surprise for many people. And with COVID, in many ways, the work has been done about the relevance of trauma and adversity. That's just there in the space. So, so I think about it as a spectrum. I'm happy to say more about it, but that's how I think about it right now.
I know for myself, when I'm teaching or leading and talking to other people about leading or teaching, working with students and other people who are themselves teachers and leaders, just to sort of make this assumption that when you're talking to a room full of 30 people or something, that many people in the room will have had some encounter with some kind of potentially traumatic event. That it's not an if, it is.
Right.
Even if we just think about some of the stats around sexual trauma, I think it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men. Okay, well, we're talking, and that probably is an underreporting.
Right.
But if you've got a room full of 30 people, then yes, let alone all these other kinds of traumatic events.
And then to me, the question, Kate, from what you're saying is, given that, and given how incredibly powerful contemplative practices are, this invitation to ask someone to pay close and sustained attention to their inner world or their experience in the present moment, given how powerful that is, and given that we know now increasingly through research that trauma is really housed in the body and through sensations and experiences, well, what does that mean for us in contemplative practice? And I want to be clear up front. I think you both know this, but just to make it clear, I'm not someone who's fear-mongering or attempting to fear-monger and say, oh my gosh, we need to stop practicing. This is terrible. It's really to say, let's be in that conversation about, given what you said, Kate, how can mindfulness teachers who are in a very powerful position be most responsible and most effective in their role? And if someone had a difficult experience around trauma. And I know this is something you both are working in, specifically around mindfulness and compassion. One
question I do want to get at to see if you have a particular stance on this, or it's just kind of a function of how we all talk, which is talking about an event or events as being a trauma versus a potentially traumatic event or an adverse event, or because that's something that I get sort of tripped up on personally sometimes, is to call the event traumatic versus the reaction to the event. Now, obviously, there are certain events that most people would experience as traumatic, but there's a lot of variability there. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on your choice of language for what do you call these events that
Oh, this is such a good point. I'm sure we could just spend the whole period of the podcast right here. So one thing I've found in writing, talking about trauma in groups, is that it's controversial. I mean, immediately we're in some deep water because, when I pulled back from it, the more I pulled back, when we talk about definitions of traumatic stress, I feel like we're really talking about whose pain and suffering is seen or legitimized in a particular culture, and potentially pain, suffering, and trauma that is not as readily seen. So here we are in the US, for example, having a very active, dynamic, challenging conversation around racial justice or racial injustice, interactions of people of color and Black people with the police. There's just such an intense atmosphere around it. And then we have this whole conversation of, is it traumatic? Is it not? So Kate, I'm with you in it. Mm-hmm. My definition of trauma comes from, the one that I've been using comes from Pat Ogden, who's a trauma expert. She talks about trauma as any event or series of events that's stressful enough to leave us feeling helpless, overwhelmed, and profoundly unsafe. And Kate, you spoke to it. To me, the evolution of the field of trauma is starting to focus more on the impact of intense events on the nervous system of a person or a community versus the event itself. So it used to be that, we could say, okay, war, or shell shock, we had certain events that we would categorize as trauma. And if you lived through that, then you had lived through trauma. And then that definition has changed over time where, for example, because of feminist organizing in the 70s and 80s, there was an expansion of the definition of traumatic stress to include sexual violence, which is often propagated towards women. So all to say there's been this evolution and continual evolution of how we're defining trauma. And having said all that, how I would like to define it in this conversation is I'm very focused on the nervous system and the regulation and the dysregulation of the nervous system. So when I'm working with a mindfulness instructor, I'm less interested in a meditation teacher learning to diagnose PTSD. I'm more interested in them being able to assess whether someone's nervous system is being supported by a meditation practice or is ending up being more dysregulated and leaving people with less of a sense of stability and ground. So in my trainings, we talk about the definition of trauma, but then we back up and say, this is really about nervous system regulation and dysregulation and a fundamental state of psychological health. So that's a very broad answer, but that's how I've been thinking about it. What do you want to add there? What would you both say?
Yeah, I think that focusing more on the impact is much more helpful way to go. Otherwise we end up just getting totally lost in the weeds with this. It feels a very kind of paternalistic sort of top-down conversation about who decides what events qualify as traumatic. It just seems like just destined to be completely unconstructive and potentially very harmful. So I love the focus on the impact and specifically that physiological impact on the nervous system.
There is one thing that I'd like to table too in you saying that is I think that we're in an interesting moment culturally where trauma is, I'd say at times, being overused. And, people saying, wow, that fill in the blank, but, that line, that traffic jam was traumatic. The word is being used more often. And I forget the author's name, but there's a term called concept creep. We're talking about in the humanities where certain terms are being in some ways watered down and diluted. So I come from teachers who say we do need to keep a certain boundary around trauma being reserved for intense events that are having a deep physiological impact. So I'm in this tension. I'm in it, where how do we retain the heft of that word and term while at the same time acknowledging that some people might have traumatic symptoms based on things that weren't necessarily considered traumatic maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And I'm struggling with it, honestly.
Yeah, we've wrestled with that too. Yeah. Also in that tension completely. I also sort of tense up at times myself when I hear the word trauma used very broadly and widely. But I think, I feel like what we need are more words. I think it's a problem of our vocabulary right now is just being like, we only have this one word. It actually speaks to the cultural problem that we only have this word.
Definitely. I've been using adversity and trauma. Sometimes I notice in the last 6 months, I'll talk about those too, because it creates that feeling of a spectrum. So I'm with you in the challenge.
Two problems that I've come across with the definition of PTSD being so limited is some people feeling that their difficulties aren't trauma related because they don't qualify for PTSD. And the other problem is with meditator friends, when I mentioned your book's title and that we're going to be interviewing you, I got the sense that some people sort of got intimidated, like, oh my goodness, does that mean I have trauma?
Right. Yeah. Isn't this it? Isn't this so tricky? What I found in my work with meditation students, with clients when I was working as a trauma professional, is that for some people, the word trauma was very empowering. They'd say, wow, finally someone is putting a name or a term to a survival-based experience that I've been having over time. Mm-hmm. And other people, Alex, I feel like you're speaking to this, feel actually disempowered and ashamed, which I think trauma comes with a tremendous amount of shame. Maybe we can unpack that too around how that works with self-compassion and compassion practices generally. But so I'm with you, Alex. There's that fine line of how do we talk about the term and what's going to leave people feeling empowered mostly. And then what you said about trauma sensitive practice, some people will dismiss the work and say, well, I don't have trauma and I don't see where this is useful. And other people will go down the road that you just mentioned of saying, what does that mean? I have, am I in trouble? Or so it's a very dynamic conversation.
I also sense among people who've been teaching mindfulness, not just mindfulness also, but just anything kind of body oriented. I have a background as a yoga teacher, and I think yoga teachers too, that although there's such great caring in this community, that it's also sometimes really hard to accept, like, I might have hurt people, or I might have been teaching in a way that alienated people. Like it goes so against the good wishes of the sort of bodhisattva vows and, things that people really earnestly are trying to do well.
Yeah. A lot of the people that I train and work with, that's their initial impulse. And I really appreciate the people that I meet in contemplative communities who are saying, well, I want to make sure that I'm not hurting people. It's the last thing I would want to do. So they come with this very noble intention to me, speaking of the Noble Mind podcast, a noble intention of saying, let me raise my consciousness and have a skill level and competence so that I could meet someone well and prevent re-traumatization. But Kate, this is to me a crux of this conversation, is that there is, and Alex, I think you're speaking to it too, a sweet spot in this work where I think if we lean too far into trauma and fragility and treating people as if they live through a trauma, they're somehow broken or they're going to be in trouble with meditation. I think we can tack way too far in that direction that fundamentally disempowers people and doesn't trust people's resource and resilience. And then at the same time, Alex, as you're bringing in, like, to actually legitimize certain forms of harm that maybe are not seen or acknowledged as painful and add a form of adversity. So for me as a teacher, I'm constantly trying to find that balance point of, I want to give people choice and leave them empowered, but I don't want to baby them. I don't want to coddle them and treat them as if they're fragile, because I see humans as fundamentally anti-fragile, that we grow through adversity and challenge. Anyway, I don't know what you both think about that, but to me, it's this very dynamic place of not too much, not too little.
I agree 100%. Yeah.
This is one of the, as I've learned more about compassion, this seems like one of the unique tensions inside of compassion work, that it's not, I've heard some teachers, I think it was Christopher Germer and Kirsten Neff, talk about different qualities of self-compassion, that sometimes we need it to be more active and other times it's more passive or soft, that it's not just that we're not just coddling people. Self-compassion work isn't just about, we're trying to make the water warm. And so does that hold relevance for you both with compassion work?
Yes, absolutely. So the yin and yang compassion as defined in mindful self-compassion. The firefighter who runs into a burning building is also acting out of compassion.
Yeah, I think one part that gets emphasized a lot is the softer self-caring, self-kindness, kind of warm, cozy practices. That's what people think when they think self-compassion or being kind to oneself. They think about, wrapping themselves in a cozy blanket or taking a hot bath or something like that, and we all need a little bit more of that in our lives, probably, especially now. Right. But, and it does sort of, it raises the hackles of people who, have tried their whole lives to motivate themselves with self-criticism and harsh self-judgment. And so it can be really challenging to even do that. But then, as you're saying, also there's a strength in a certain kind of active compassion as well. Like Alex was saying, the firefighter running into the building to save someone, or even being assertive and standing up for yourself, or, doing things you don't like to do that are in your best interest, but that are unpleasant, that involve unpleasant emotions or experiences, but it's a self-caring act, to endure the difficulties at times. So there's a nuance there. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah.
So our next question is about sort of systemic political and social justice dimensions of trauma, thinking about it as it intersects with racial justice movements, social justice movements going on right now. And as you're saying, just in the last couple of years, there's been so much more open discussion about trauma. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. I know that you've sort of been thinking a lot about how do we teach mindfulness in a trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive way.
To continue to think a lot about it. And I'd say the main encouragement that I make for anyone in a position of leadership, meaning someone who's working as a clinician or a coach or a meditation teacher, but anyone who's in a position of some authority or power, my argument is that the more aware that someone is about the social conditions that are shaping someone's lived experience, then the more effective they'll be in their role. And I say that as someone, so to talk about trauma, I say that as someone who was trained to think about trauma almost entirely as an individual experience and an individual tragedy, which it is for sure. And the further that I've gone into different writing and research, there's been an encouragement from people who are often more targeted by oppression to say, please make connections between someone's personal experience of trauma and the social conditions that were there, really connecting the dots between personal and social. So let me give one example that surprised me. People would say, well, what about accidents? Like there's a number of people experience traumatic accidents. And that holds importance if someone's coming into meditation practice. And so, if you were a meditation teacher and someone had a traumatic accident, of course, you'd be compassionate towards them. And maybe they were having flashbacks of the accident in practice. You could be compassionate for their individual experience. And then if you pull back from this, even something seemingly benign as an accident, this happened inside of a social context that we can be aware of. So, and the example with someone who experiences a traumatic accident is the UN tells us, there's a research report that came out recently, that internationally, people who experience traumatic accidents are far more likely to be poor and working class in the world. So even something where you look at an accident, if you pull back far enough, you see, of course, there's going to be these conditions that shape someone's experience, that impact. And so to me, it's a willingness to be curious and not just reduce a traumatic experience down to something where someone just needs to basically pull up their bootstraps and say, okay, well, let me just do all the individual work I can do. But maybe there's also social aspects that could be acknowledged to build trust and safety with the people that we're working with. That's where I'm at right now. But what do you both think, or what would you add?
Are you familiar with SAMHSA's guidelines on trauma-informed care?
I do, but please refresh me.
Yeah, I don't remember all 6 of them off the top of my head, but I remember there's 6.
Yeah.
And they've created this set of basically how to create a trauma-informed culture within your organization. And some of the things that they emphasize, I think, are really helpful. Things like being collaborative is one of the principles. Emphasizing safety and trust is are another couple principles. And what that points to for me is, again, this sort of assumption among those folks who don't have a trauma-informed mindset or haven't kind of had the sort of wake-up moment, whatever, in their lives. And I guess I've had this at some point, I can't quite say where it shifted, to just assume that everyone feels safe and to assume people know they could speak up. Of course it's a collaborative environment. What do you mean? I need to do something to emphasize that? Or, of course, people can trust me because I say so. I say it in every meeting or whatever, but that doesn't create the culture, So I guess I'm making that connection there on the systems level.
Yeah, and that gets to, I think, one of to bring it really right into mindfulness and meditation, there's this issue of compliance, which is, some will know, a really well-studied and empirically validated psychological concept that people will tend to want to please people in positions of power and authority. Mm-hmm. And so I'm with you, Kate. I did the same thing where I was thinking, well, I trust that someone would come to me and let me know if they were having any difficulty in meditation. Maybe that's connected to trauma or not. And so I can run with that assumption. And trauma-sensitive mindfulness, I'd say, kind of tacks back in a different direction and says, well, there are probably ways that we could build in empowering people to have a conversation with us, or not assuming that everyone's okay. Because as I've learned, a lot of people who experience, say, traumatic flashbacks or difficulty in their practice, it's challenging to share that. There's often a lot of shame and isolation associated with that. And it takes a lot of bravery to actually share it. So to me, again, it's about finding that balance of giving people opportunities to raise their hand and say, I might need something different here, while at the same time not coddling people and, we have to walk on eggshells and assume that everyone's going to get hurt. There's a middle ground. And just to define how trauma-sensitive mindfulness, how I define it, you're talking about SAMHSA, is a 4R definition that basically says, if someone is trauma-informed as a mindfulness teacher, they've realized how widespread trauma is, they can recognize trauma symptoms, they can respond effectively, and they can prevent re-traumatization. So it's these R's of realizing, recognizing symptoms, responding effectively, preventing re-traumatization. That's the main headline. And of course, it's a lifetime of practice, but that's just to define what I'm really up to in the work.
Really helpful, yeah.
Of course, when people have a shame disorder, or when shame figures prominently, and I think figures prominently in trauma almost by definition, perhaps.
I mean, it's often a part. Trauma really seems inseparable from shame.
Inseparable, right? So, by definition, they're going to hide aspects of themselves that they consider shameful, that other people will reject them for.
Right.
So then, and they will have a lifetime of experience keeping a poker face.
Right. Shame, as I think many of us will know, it has that quality of I'm bad, and we often wants to tuck away those parts of us. And you made me think about a neuroscientist. It's Antonio Damasio. You might know him. I've forgotten the title of this book. But one of the ways that I've heard him talk about trauma is that we become very skilled at hiding certain things from ourselves. And that the brain, and some aspects of the brain, at least the mind, can become a bit of a screen for that which was too overwhelming for us to tolerate in a given moment. And so we're both hiding it from ourselves, whether that's dissociating from certain memories or sensations, or actually avoiding a certain street corner or a certain conversation. There's ways that we're hiding, Alex, that you're speaking to. And then this is where this conversation feels so important. What does it mean then to be inviting people into a practice that to me is fundamentally anti-hiding? It really is empowering someone with a tool to uncover. And that's been my experience, at least, of mindfulness practices, with these different layers, this excavation of things I didn't even know were happening in the present moment, whether it's my aversion or my attachment. So it can seem like a paradox. How do these two fit together? Mindfulness doesn't cause trauma, the practice, but mindfulness will reveal trauma to people, that hiding. And then how do we handle it? It's a big responsibility, I think, for all of us.
What do you think? I mean, the 4 R's are a great sort of starting point, and then probably under each R, there would be a lot of actionable potential things to do do that,
right.
to fulfill that R.
We could take any of those R's and say, well, how do we respond effectively? What does that look like? And then here's this is the courses that I lead, here's the book, here's a whole number of practices. I think for this conversation here, what I'd love to talk to you both about is almost the quality of embodiment that one would need. I think about these 4 R's less as a stepwise process, as much as 4 notes of a scale, or 4 notes of a chord, you could say, that are played at once. And in playing that at the same time, there's a sense of harmony and integration. And so what I get very curious about is, what would a meditation teacher need to embody in order to support a meditation student who's struggling with trauma? And maybe if I could tell one quick story here to, I think, illustrate this. I was in a meditation group, and at the end of the group, it was a small group, maybe 20 people. We did a go around about how that was. And one of the students, who was a bit of a newer student, said, honestly, I hated that. I wanted to run screaming from the room. That was terrible. And I was really impressed. I thought, that's very
good for them, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a moment for sure. I think it was a risk, and everyone got quiet. And I looked at the teacher, and I saw the teacher take a breath. They're sitting in a chair, they relaxed, and they said, "That's great. Well, do you know how far away you'd want to run?" And it was such a cool question. And I watched the student. The student was like, "Wow." And then the student said, "Well, there's a hill. Honestly, we were in a residential area, and I'd want to go to that top of that hill. I'd want to get the F out of here." And the teacher said, "Well, do you want to do that? Would you're welcome to go there right now. My one request is, would you just bring someone with you?" And everyone kind of got a little surprised, looking around. And this person said, "Okay." So they left, and they came back. I'll never forget it. About 8 minutes later, and they had this look on their face of just a tremendous aliveness and almost joy. So we checked in and said, "How'd it go?" And they said, they did wind sprints up this hill, back and forth. And they just said, "I just want to thank you for trusting what I needed." And now, whether or not this was related to trauma, the reason I bring that up with the R's is there was this quality of curiosity and respect that the teacher exemplified. They could have personalized it and been like, "Wow, I guess I effed up the meditation. I'm not good enough." But instead, they just got curious. And trauma, as you both know, it's so often about these deep-seated survival-based responses. They're automatic. We're not choosing them. And that was an example for me of that kind of embodiment that we need to be a trauma-sensitive teacher. Now, we can learn, we can do year-long training, and that's what I offer people, but there's core embodiments that I'm curious about. That's what I see as most important.
Your book greatly resonated with my experience of meditation. It was very validating to read it. Before I learned mindful self-compassion, MSC, mindfulness didn't fully deliver for me. I think it was because I didn't know how to soothe myself, which got in the way of accepting difficult experiences. And in trying to troubleshoot, the answer I received was keep meditating, which didn't help me. Also, I had concluded that since mindfulness seemed to help everything and everyone else, I must have been beyond hope.
Right. Yeah, that I'd say is one of the primary focuses of trainings that when I offer or when I'm just talking to people is mindfulness is amazing. I mean, that ability to pay close and sustained attention, or what we call present moment awareness, that sustained attention to see what's happening when it's happening, is, I'd say, actually, from my trauma training, essential in trauma recovery. And it's one tool, as many listeners will know, that can sometimes be overused, where it's like, we become a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And yes. In my experience, this is the main thing I wanted to communicate in this work is people who are struggling with trauma. Trauma is not just a negative emotion. It's involving deep-seated survival-based responses that require more than mindfulness to untangle. And sometimes, I have heard stories from people that sitting or being in a sustained mindfulness practice actually really did untangle their trauma, and that's amazing. I'm interested in the people who need more tools. So we could talk about these tools, but maybe they need certain regulation practices, or they can connect with self-compassion as an example. Maybe they need to learn self-compassion. Maybe they need resourcing practices. Maybe they need to learn to work with their attention differently. There's so many different levers that we can help people work with. And as you're saying, Alex, just to not come back to just go back to the cushion. Just go back to the cushion. We often just need more than that.
Yeah, and then the other thing is you emphasize the window of tolerance, and you explain that in a way that, for me, clarified it the most of anything I've read.
Window of tolerance from neuroscientist Dan Siegel is a proposal that there's basically a sweet spot between too much and too little in any system. You could think of it like a Goldilocks principle. And when we apply that to trauma, as a number of occupational therapists and trauma professionals did, is they said, okay, in terms of the nervous system, there is a zone of what we call optimal arousal, where we're most likely to be connected to ourselves, have a sense of stability, choice, and agency. On either side of that, we have hyperarousal, which is basically too much arousal, physiological arousal. We might have intrusive thoughts, we might be hypervigilant or anxious. And then on the lower end, we have too little arousal or hypoarousal. So what I appreciate what you bringing this in is, I do think people learning to access their window is really important. And one of the lessons of the window is that more is not always better. when it comes to mindfulness. Just it's not just like, keep going back to the cushion doesn't always elicit the response that helps someone get back into their window. But the core of trauma work is that if we just are trying to stay in the window, we don't always grow. And that leaving the window isn't necessarily always bad. And so a trauma professional will actually help people work at the edges of their window and say, can you be with this experience of, say, hypervigilance? Can you be present with this? And this is where mindfulness is so useful, is say, Kate, we're hanging out and you're feeling out of your window, but you have that skill of mindfulness. You're able to be with that. You come back into your window and there's something healing about that for you. So the window is it's a model that we can start to work with and empower people with, but I wouldn't say it's something that we also need to be confined by, like, oh, you only can stay in the window. It's just, but it gets back to that dynamic balance that we're working all the time.
Right. What happens, I think, again, sort of thinking systems level, is that people show up to meditation centers, mindfulness workshops, yoga studios, what have you, and the people who the instruction works for keep coming back. Mm-hmm. And the people who instruction doesn't work for don't keep coming back. So then there's a selection over decades, of communities of practice that end up sidelining people who have had these traumatic experiences and for whom the practices as they're taught don't work. So I know we were talking a little bit about Shambhala beforehand and spiritual communities more broadly, but then now I think there's much more of a reckoning going on about who have we been sidelining, who has not been coming back to our centers, who's not been being served by what we've been doing. Right. And maybe we can change something to improve that going forward.
Oh, I'm really interested in how communities are grappling with that right now, because I also think, is there a limit and a line where we say, it's okay that we're not everything to all people? Kate, when I hear you say that, there's ways where I could hear that. I think if I had heard that a year or two ago, I think of that as, well, a principle of, say, diversity would be then, well, we need to move in the direction that ensure we're serving all people and make this as widely accessible as possible, which I think there's something in that's really important. And then at some point, where's the line where we say, wow, like, maybe a group is self-selecting and then that's okay. Yeah. I'm just in that tension. I'm wondering where that line is for people.
I mean, my personal perspective is that I think we could still be a lot more to more people without getting to that spot where we have to start wondering, are we overdoing it? I don't think we've been doing it at all.
Right. And people are having some real look in the mirror conversations, I feel like right now about in Shambhala, you just named it, about ideally, this could be a great reckoning. Yes. I mean, the country right now, here we are having this conversation in such an intense moment. And the stress test on U.S. democracy right now, it's just showing us, I think, what was here. Someone described it as, there's a woman named Elizabeth Stanley who wrote this book, Widen the Window, to get back to something you just said, Kate, about expanding the window. I think she was talking about the ways that it felt like with the coronavirus, it's almost like the tide has gone out on the East Coast, and you see, suddenly you can see all the bramble and the coral and everything that was there. And it's just a moment that I think a lot is being revealed in a big way.
Yeah, and I think maybe there's some of the tensions in our culture right now, not certainly. So this is a mirror from the spiritual communities to the broader, sort of U.S. environment right now, is that I think there are people who are saying we can't be all things to all people. Like, I can't be asked to do this work, around racial justice, let's say, or, other areas of oppression. Like, you can't ask me to do that. I'm not going to do that. It's too much. I can't be all things to all people, that idea. And then there's, more and more people saying, maybe we could do a little better. Maybe we could move in that direction, and there's some way that we can grow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It makes me think, what are the principles that we're living or teaching by? And I've been in that boat myself, where I just feel like, I don't know if I can do this. And then I have to kind of pull back on, well, what are the principles I want in my teaching? What's going to keep us going? So I'm with you. Yeah. Kate, I just want to say one thing you had said a couple minutes ago on widening the window. I was teaching and someone said, do you think that enlightenment is a window that's 100% open? Basically the widest window that has no borders on it. Because, there's something when you meet teachers who have, or wise people who have a wide window, it takes a lot to perturb them, right? Like there's a way that they can handle the vicissitudes of life. They have a wide window. I was just with Tara Brach, and I thought, wow, she's just seen so much or lived through so much that it takes a lot to have her hit her edge, which I think makes her a really effective teacher. So I do think that widening the window over time is part of the path. To me, that's part of the life path, is that we can be with life in greater and greater fluctuations or in different scenarios. And I think practice is so useful for that, as is self-compassion. We grow that window, and trauma and oppression shrink the window. So here we are, 2020, the window is being pushed, I think, in a big way. And collectively, individually and collectively. And how do we respond? It's tough. It's intense.
Because all the experiences that are going on for so many of us are making us want to shut down and close the window, like the COVID crisis and, whatever that's done to our families or communities, and, unemployment and all the struggles, the relationship challenges that have been coming up, family crises, all of that makes the window shrink. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of movement towards please open the window more, please care about other people more, pay attention to injustice, pay attention to oppression. So maybe that's part of what is causing so much of this tension right now, is those sort of competing forces.
Yes, exactly. And I was having a conversation with Elizabeth Stanley about this, the challenge of exactly what you said, Kate. There's a call for widening the window and including more and more people and communities into a spirit of justice and organizing. And yet here we are in a moment where collectively that window is being pushed down. Mm-hmm. So it's actually just a bind. It's a really intense bind. And if we're out of our window and trying to enact a lot of change in our lives or social change, I think that can be a setup. Mm-hmm. And at the same time telling someone, well, you need to be regulated in your window to do good work, that's also irresponsible. So I just think it's a jam. It is a jam that we're in. And I'm most interested in what are the tools that support individuals and groups to widen their window for the sake of fill in the blank. That could be enlightenment. That could be social change. It's different for all of us.
One of the things I really love about your book is your emphasis in connecting trauma as it manifests for the individual person in biological and psychological domains with social, economic, political, systemic considerations. You care a great deal about integrating trauma work with social and political change work.
Yeah. I have good teachers. I was in an organization called Generative Somatics, which has been doing somatic or embodiment work with social change work. Just give one quick example. We were working with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is a group of people that are organizing domestic workers here in the US, given that there's such a strong contingent of often undocumented workers here. And we were doing embodiment practices and mindfulness practices with the group in generative somatics. And one of the things that the group noticed in itself was that there was an automatic appease and collapsing of dignity in the face of stress. Mm-hmm. And when this was talked about individually, people often had stories, domestic workers, of saying, me getting small, me appeasing someone in a position of authority took care of my safety. Mm-hmm. But then when you were with the entire group who were trying to organize and mobilize thousands of domestic workers, they needed a different level of embodiment to evoke change. And so it was one of those moments, light bulb moments for me of realizing, wow, trauma and organizing and social change and mindfulness are just inseparable. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate you saying that, Alex, that there's just so much overlap and that trauma is not just an individual experience. It lives in collective bodies as well. And I think it can be useful for us just to have that conversation.
So I know we have a number of listeners who are involved in education and leadership and the therapeutic community or human services more broadly. I'm wondering if you might offer some kind of on-the-ground ideas for implementation. What are a few takeaways people might be able to bring back into their lives and work?
Yes. What can we actually do? Question part of this. It's so key. I'll say a couple things in terms of trauma-sensitive mindfulness, so looking specifically at meditation. In my experience, 40% of the game, so to speak, is awareness. So just by virtue of people having listened to this conversation or having some awareness of the potential pitfalls that people or students can run into inside of a mindfulness body-based practice, that's a lot, because then it opens the door to people seeing or sensing what they might not have been seeing. Wow, that person looked a bit dissociated. Maybe I should check in with them, for example. So that's one. Just knowing is almost half of it. And then at a very practical level, I'd say two things. One is offering choice. Choice is a really important principle that we can implement in whatever role that we're in. And that can range. So, we have trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed work in education, in healthcare. And there's a whole bunch of different practices that people can engage in. For example, offering someone the choice of whether they'd like the door open or closed during a conversation, or asking permission before you make physical contact with someone. These are all small things that we can do to give choice back to someone. And trauma survivors or people struggling with trauma, they often had choice taken away. And so the more that we can offer it back to them, the better. Inside of meditation practice, for example, a couple examples would be giving people different objects or anchors of attention to work with. So usually we tend to work with the breath as an anchor of attention, place to come back to. I'd say trauma-sensitive mindfulness practice offers people maybe 1 to 3 anchors. So maybe they could use, and many people will know this, but you could use sensations connected to the feet on the floor, the hands in the lap, the buttocks in the chair, or sound. Sometimes people work with sound. So offering people a choice of what kind of anchor to use is one example. Letting people know they can open their eyes in practice. Letting people know they could shift their posture. I mean, these seem like really basic things, but it's as we get back to compliance, people want to do well by the practice and they don't want to feel weak. Mm-hmm. So we want to build in choice. But again, I'll finish here, getting back to what you said earlier. If we dilute the practice with too much choice, then we can be practicing avoidance. Mm-hmm. And I say that as someone who, I'm Canadian, I don't like to make people feel uncomfortable. And so the first couple times I offered practice, I was barraging people with choice. Well, you can open your eyes, or you can close them, or you can do whatever you want. And just, there's no container to it.
Right.
So choice is big. Choice is really big. And I pause there in terms of the practicalities.
Another great gift I think one can offer that is, I guess it's simple and pragmatic, is just listening to people. Because I know for myself, just sort of thinking, this is something I hadn't really understood before. And now here's a person I'm able to talk to who, for whatever reason, is willing to open up to me. Let me really get curious and try to understand, because I think it's helped me more to hear about people's personal experiences and lived experiences. Like Alex and I talking about going to the same meditation session, and then afterwards have had very different experiences of the teacher and how, whether we felt insisted upon or intruded upon by their instructions, and, just really getting curious about how other people receive the teachings and the instruction has been really helpful for me.
Isn't it amazing the ways that we just impact each other so differently? And, two really practical things I've learned over time is to, when I'm having a conversation with someone, Kate, as you're mentioning, is to at least ask 1, maybe 2 questions before I jump in with opinion, like really express some curiosity, as you're saying, which can shift my whole position and posture. Like, let me actually try to get curious. And then in terms of choice, when we're offering choices, as you would with, I think, smaller kids, not to infantilize people, but to really offer maybe 2, max 3 choices. So with posture, you could be seated, stand, but we don't want to just leave it wide open, because I think that can feel uncontained. So those are 2 really basic to-dos that I come back to.
I think that's great, because I totally agree. Choice, you can be overwhelmed by choice, and then it could be like, what am I practicing? Am I learning something here? I'm just doing whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much, David. Where can people find you and engage with you and your work?
Yeah, well, my website's the best way to go, which is davidtreleaven.com. And The training, if people are interested in doing more in-depth training around trauma-sensitive mindfulness, it really comes with it's kind of a two-pronged approach. One is this preventing re-traumatization. Like what can we learn to first do no harm at a core level, which you'd be surprised. We could get to unpack we didn't get to get into it specifically here, but why at a physiological level would someone run into problems inside of a meditation practice? That's worth unpacking, And then from there, we move into talking about these more advanced tools of self-regulation that people can apply or that you can offer people inside of meditation practice. Some of these are, you know what I did? I'll just maybe this is a place to end. When I wrote the book, I thought, what have I learned from all the interviews I've done about how we heal trauma? And one thing that came up was a sentence that said something like, we heal trauma gradually through the body, in relationship, in a social context, and often using mindfulness. And so I took that sort of opening sentence and then I broke that all down into those different components, looking at mindfulness and practices and self-compassion practices really through those lenses. Like, hey, how do we work with the body? How do we work with attention? Social context. So those are some of the principles that I like to work with. We can have a part 2 if you want. We can go deeper into it, but kind of use trauma theory as a lens to look at mindfulness and then discern best practices from there.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, David. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for your work.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.